Welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining our second Winged Wednesday webinar. My name's Rachel from Bats Without Borders, and I'm actually based in Malawi, so I won't be sharing my video. If you could all please stay on muted with your videos off, just for the same reason, for the internet stability. But you'll be able to ask questions throughout the talk today. You can either if you put it into chat, you can either do that publicly for everybody to see your questions, or if you prefer, you can do it privately. At the end of the talk, there'll also be an opportunity if you want to, in chat, you can actually raise your hand and you can ask your question directly. We're going to be recording this webinar today, and we'll be sharing that with you on YouTube. I'm delighted to say that next week we have Professor Ara Monogem, who's going to be releasing our Bat Bible again, the second one coming out in August. So he's going to be joining us next week, and we've had quite a lot of requests for him to talk, so we're delighted that he's able to join us. I just wanted to give you a little overview. So Bats Without Borders is a NGO that works across Southern Africa, and we've been registered since 2013. Bat Conservation Africa is a network of researchers, ecologists and conservationists across mainland Africa and also Madagascar. And for those of you who joined us for Nancy's talk last week, she introduced us to the GBAT-Net, Global Union of Bat Diversity Networks. And this is a fantastic way for us to all share and connect. So please do follow them on Facebook and Twitter. Today's speaker is Dr. Hernani Oliveira, and he's going to be talking to us about his work on bats in the Brazilian savanna. Hernani did his PhD at the Queen's Mary University of London, looking at the impact of severe floods and droughts on molecular food webs of bats in the rainforest in Costa Rica. He then went on to do a postdoc at Charles University, looking at altitudinal and seasonal changes on biodiversity patterns of Mount Cameroon here in Africa. More recently, he did another postdoc at Iowa State University, looking at seed dispersal of Mariana fruit bats on the Pacific islands of Rota. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Hernani.
Thank you for the introduction, Rachel. So, as Rachel said, I'll be sharing a little bit of my experience here in Brazil, especially more specifically in the Cerrados of Brazil, the savannas. Even though I have spent quite a lot of time outside Brazil in the last years, most of my work, or most of my life, or one third of my life I have spent in the Cerrados of Brazil, studying, living, or going for field work with bats or other animals. So this is basically a quick talk outline that I'm going to follow during the talk. So basically I'm going to talk about what is the Cerrado, Cerrado distribution, Cerrado ecology, Cerrado threats and conservation, Cerrado mammals, and then bat conservation on the Cerrado, and then some future directions about the work that I'm doing here, but also related with bat research on the savannas of Brazil. So one of the first things that intrigued me when I left Brazil for the first time to study outside was that when you talk about Brazil, many people think about football, soccer, they think about indigenous people, they think about the Amazon forest, samba, all the biodiversity that we have here. But usually people don't connect very much the idea of Brazil with savannas. They usually think about Africa, lions, all the iconic animals, wild dogs, zebras, or even maybe to Australia, like the dingoes or the kangaroos in a less extent. But I think what few people know outside Brazil, or at least seem to me sometimes, is that Brazil and South America is also composed of an immense portion of savannas. And we have also a lot of iconic animals here, which are famous for us, but I'm not sure how much they are famous outside Brazil, at least not as much as the iconic African mammals. But we have also bush dogs, maned wolves, crab-eating foxes, and also some species of armadillos here that play quite a lot of important roles in the ecosystem.
Oh, Hernani, sorry to interrupt you. We just can't see your screen. We can't see your presentation.
Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry. Let me quick come back. Okay, sorry. I will. Okay, sorry about that. Can you see it now? Can you see it now? The
Yes, we
screen?
can. Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so just coming quickly back a little bit. Yeah, I'm going to talk about anthropogenic changes on bat species and their interactions with Cerrado. This is the talk outline. So what is the Cerrado? Cerrado distribution, Cerrado ecology, Cerrado threats and conservation, Cerrado memos, then bat conservation of the Cerrado, and then some future directions about my work, but also what is going to be done here in the Cerrados as well. So when you think about Brazil, usually we think about all these kind of things that I have said before, like so soccer. We think about indigenous people due to all the forests that we have, still some left, like in Brazil, all the biodiversity, the Amazon forest, samba, all the festivals and the carnival and all the parties that we have here in Brazil as well. But few people think about savannas when you talk about Brazil. They think more about when you talk about
Sorry,
savannas, usually they
Hernani,
think about,
sorry to interrupt you again. For some reason, your screen is actually blank. We can only see a blank page.
oh, okay, sorry.
So maybe,
Let me come. Can you see it now? Like, oops. Can you?
now we can see it. Yes, we can see. Yes,
Oh, okay.
yeah, there we go. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. So as I was saying, sorry about that. We're talking about anthropogenic change on bat species and interactions in the Cerrado. This is the talk outline. But this is what I was talking about when I said about what people think when we talk about Brazil in general, or at least what I think, or people usually mention that if they have never been here, what they usually I think they come to their minds. So soccer, indigenous people, biodiversity, Amazon forest, carnival, parties, women in general as well. It can be one of the things. But few people think about the biodiversity and actually, no, not the biodiversity, but the savannas in Brazil. Usually when you think about savannas, I think most people think about African animals. So all the iconic animals that you have in Africa, such as lions, wild dogs, zebras, and all the other ones. And in less extent, I think in the Australian savannas with dingoes and kangaroos as well. But we also have savannas in Brazil. Actually, savannas, they are 1/5 of the Brazilian territory here. And also they are close to 10% of the South American territory. So they are actually a huge portion of what we have here in terms of our landscapes. And we also have some iconic animals here as well. They might not be as famous as the African ones, but they also play a big, important role in their ecosystems. But they're still very, very unknown. We know very little about most of the mammals that we have here in the Cerrados. I'm going to explain some reasons why as well. But we have here bush dogs, maned wolves, crab-eating foxes, and also armadillo species. When you talk about savanna, you need to talk a little bit about how, what's the definition of savannas, because savanna can be a quite variable landscape. They can show a quite variable landscape structure. So I think it's good to have a clear definition of what we're talking about when it says savanna, the word savanna, not to confuse with other kind of landscapes, which might have some similarities with them, but they're slightly different in terms of the distribution, but also how the ecosystem functions as well. So when you talk about savannas, I took this definition from this paper. So savannas are defined as having open tree canopies and a more or less continuous grass layer, a classification that differentiates savanna from closed canopy forests and perhaps more from pure grasslands, but which encompasses substantial variability in vegetation ecosystem structure. So when you talk about savannas, we're basically talking about variation in habitat structure and vegetation structure. And but we have grasslands, we have forests, we have more savanna-like environments, but this all is part of a more diverse type of landscape, as you can see here in the picture. Why these other landscapes, they tend to be more homogeneous than what we have in the savannas. One important thing as well and interesting is that savanna is also distributed in a very specific parts of the world. So usually they follow some the rainfall patterns. They're also related with how the rain falls in relation to the equator. So we have you rarely have any type of savannas very close to the equator, apart from some exceptions. But most of the savannas are distributed in this latitude range. that we have around the globe, slightly below the equator and a little bit above, in a very strict or very defined range. And each of these landscapes that they have savannas, they hold quite different animal communities. So in the savannas of South America, you have anteaters, you have maned wolves, you have all these types of different species. When you go to Africa, you have all the known ones that we know, such as the elephants and all the iconic species from Africa. And when you go to Australia, you have all the specific ones from Australia as well. They only happen there and nowhere else in the world. But as I was saying, savannas, they are by definition a very heterogeneous landscape. So when you talk about savannas, you see patches of grasslands together with gully forests, which are more tall, more connected canopies. You also have more a middle range between these two environments, and they're also connected and together in the landscape with different configurations, but they're all together most of the time. You rarely have, or sometimes it's more rare to have some big patches of just one type of habitat types like this. Usually they're connected and dispersed across the landscape depending on the rainfall, but also on the soil, also on the rivers that they fall, they go on these places. But just to give you a brief idea about what we have here in Brazil, and it's also similar in some ways in Africa as well, we have all these ranges of vegetation types, habitat types in the Cerrados of Brazil. So we have mainly forest formations, which are tall trees. They are mainly dominated by trees. Usually frugivores are the main seed dispersers in these landscapes. More connected canopies. Then you go to a transition to savannas, which are like smaller trees or more shrubs. They're more disconnected canopies. The trees are more sparsely dispersed in the landscape until you go to grasslands, which are called grasslands, but in this case, they're grasslands within the savannas. There are some types of landscapes that are called grasslands, but they are only mainly formed by grasslands, which is not the case in the savannas. Also, one important thing about the Cerrado is that Cerrado is a biodiversity hotspot. So it's highly threatened. And also we have a huge proportion of the plant species here are endemic to the Cerrado. We have roughly 10,000 plant species in the Cerrado, which 44% only happens in the Cerrados of Brazil. This level of endemicity can vary a little bit between taxa, but between plants, within plants, it's very, very high. And most of the plants that we see here are only found, or a lot of the plants that we see here are only found in the Cerrados of Brazil. So they play a huge importance in terms of the plant species composition of savannas. It's also regarded as the most biodiverse savanna in the world as well, due to the high plant species richness that it has. However, Cerrado is highly, 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 highly threatened. Actually, probably in the next 10 years, we're likely to not have anything or almost anything of Cerrado outside protected areas. If we don't do anything now, probably everything's going to vanish vanish already very quickly, as I'm going to show and talk a little bit more as well. But the main threats for the Cerrados are mainly these three ones. So we have basically soybean plantations, which are huge patches of fields that are mainly covered by soybeans. And Brazil is one of the main producers of soybeans and exporters as well to the world. We also have cattle ranching, which can be slightly less damaging to the landscape, because sometimes they still leave some trees in the landscape for protecting the cows or give some shade to the cows. But you also have fires, which play a huge importance in the natural dynamics of the ecosystem. But when they happen in the end of the dry season, they can be very damaging, and they can have high mortality rates for animals and plants as well. So these are basically the three main threats that Cerrado is facing currently and has been facing the last decades. One interesting thing about the Cerrado is that Cerrado is mainly not located close to the coast of Brazil. And as Brazil has been colonized firstly in the coast, most of the deforestation of the Cerrado is not so recent. The vegetation of Brazil started to be deforested in the coast, so basically the Atlantic rainforest. But the big trigger in the deforestation of the Cerrado happened with the transfer of the capital of Brazil from Rio de Janeiro to Brasília, which is in the center of Brazil. And this started to have a massive impact in terms of the development of the country, but also in terms of deforestation rates that we have seen in Cerrados and in the center of Brazil as well. So since 1960s, so it's very, very recently, the Brasília, the capital, is only 60 years old. We have seen rising numbers of deforestations in Cerrado due to the expansion of the cities, but also due to development of the agriculture and the cattle ranching, which was also one of the main proposals of changing the capitals as well to the center of Brazil, to develop the center of the country and also the Cerrado as well. When you talk about deforestation in Brazil, a lot of people talk and think about the rainforest, the Amazon forest, but what few people know and think about is that actually Cerrado is being deforested in a faster pace than the Amazon forest. So when you compare the square kilometer rates of deforestation per year, most of the years actually Cerrado has been deforested more, or at least in absolute numbers. We have a higher deforestation rates of the Cerrado than the Amazon forest. And the Amazon forest more than twice the size of the Cerrado in total. So we are losing the Cerrado in a much faster pace, or the savannas of Brazil are being lost in a much faster pace than the Amazon forest and other kind of forests that we have here. We still have some portions of the Cerrado left, but they're vanishing very, as I said, very, very, very quickly. So in the last 17 years, we lost roughly 23% of the whole cover of Cerrado landscape. So it's more or less being lost in a more or less space of 1% of the total cover of the original landscape per year, a little bit more. This according to a very recent estimate. It's also another danger and worry is that we are still not protecting Cerrado very well. So when you look at the protected areas in the Cerrado, most of them are, or a lot of them are not strict in terms of the conservation settings that they have. So actually less than 5% of the Cerrado are protected within very strict conservation protected areas across the landscape. So this is very worrying because we're losing a lot and we're not protecting. We don't have a lot of the Cerrado protected yet, which is different in the Amazon forest. Much higher rates of the Amazon forest has been protected across the years, and also the Amazon forest gains much more attention than the Cerrado. The Cerrado was regarded in the 70s as the last agricultural frontier in the world. So a lot of people came here to actually develop the agriculture and plants and deforest the Cerrado in a way, which was also very worrying. This is also highly worrying because, as you can see here in the rates of description of new species of mammals in Brazil, we don't know I can't say we don't know almost anything, but we're still describing a lot of species. So in the last few years, we have described new species of bats, river dolphins, monkeys, and potentially even tapirs. So we're not losing just the Cerrado, we're losing a lot of mammals that we don't even know that they're there. We're discovering species in a pace that's much faster than we can actually understand them. And we're describing more than one species of mammals per year here in Brazil, which is also impacted by the deforestation of the Cerrados as well. This is also a big problem because, just to add on this, we're describing a lot of species still, but we don't know exactly how much we have in terms of biodiversity here in Brazil, in the Cerrados as well. So when you look at the records of mammal species in the BOLT systems, which is the main reservatory for DNA barcoding, we have that roughly 1% of the records are from Brazil, but Brazil has a much higher biodiversity than this. We currently have close to 800 species of mammals, depending on how you describe and how you count these mammal species, but we only have records for DNA barcoding of 163 species, and this represents a very low percentage of the records of the total mammals that we have in both systems, which is also just to show that one of the main ways that we have today, or one of the main techniques that we can use today to describe mammal species, we don't have a lot of them being used and being described in Brazil. or so we don't know exactly what we have here still. However, bats in Brazil are highly diverse. We have roughly now close to 180 species of bats in Brazil. This number has been rising along the years, and the Cerrado has close to 120 species of bats now. This is very high compared to other vegetation types in Brazil, other biomes, and even compared to the Amazon forest, which is one of the most biodiverse biomes that we have here. Bats are highly interesting here in the Cerrado and also in the Neotropical region because they're highly diverse, together with Africa and some other places. We have the only family of bats that actually evolved to eat fruits and nectar on the diet, or at least regularly eat them in the diet. And we have this family of bats, which are the most studied ones in Brazil when you talk about bats, mainly because we focus our attention more in mist nets than in acoustic records. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. But the phylostomids are a very interesting family of bats, which have regarded and famous by having these nose leaves, which we're still understanding the role of the structure and the structure on their ecology, but everything points to something related with their feeding habits. And you can see here that they have different shapes of their skulls as well. And this is also playing an important role in their habitat types, in their habitat feeding habits as well. So we have bats, they have more longer snouts, that they are more specialized on nectar. You have some bats that have skulls that are more robust, that can eat insects and even other vertebrates. You have blood-sucking bats. You have fruit-eating bats. You have also insectivores. So this is a wide range of possibilities that you can have for the bats to be eaten in terms of their food types, food items in their diets. You can see a little bit better here all the variation that we have in the skulls and also in the feeding habits of the bats. Actually, this family of bats has almost all the feeding habits of all other vertebrates in the world, which is quite impressive in terms of the evolution of the group. Interestingly, when you talk about threats to bats, these reviews show that landscape change or land use change is still the main threat to bats worldwide. So we have more than 500 species of bats, which the main threat or one of the main threats are still deforestation and landscape change. And this just adds more pressure on what we have here in the scenario here in Brazil with all the loss and all the biodiversity that we're, all the landscape change that we're having. At the same time, just in terms of studies, what has been published in the papers, we also are far from knowing actually what the impacts of deforestation are on bats here in South America. This is a review about anthropogenic effects on bats worldwide. And you can see that most of the distribution of the studies we have a lot of them in Brazil, but most of them are not actually in the Cerrados. One of my papers from my master's was actually one of the main papers in the Cerrados that were evaluating the effect of anthropogenic change on bat assemblages, and it was published in 2017. So we don't know almost or close to nothing exactly about how bats here are reacting to all these changes that are happening in the landscape and also to their life histories as well. One thing that's different here in South America in comparison to some other parts of the world is that we don't use so much, we're still introducing acoustic recordings as a technique to study bats in Brazil, but most of the history of studying bats has been with mist nets. And this is interesting because when you talk about all these effects on the bats, we are mostly focusing on phylostomids because they're the ones who actually they are mostly cocked in the mist nets. All other bats, which are more insectivores, they rarely they rarely fall in the mist nets. So we have a more limited understanding of these effects on their ecology and their response to deforestation. So most of the things I'm going to talk right now are more focused on the phylostomid bats, which are the frugivores, the especially the nectarivores. Even the insectivores, phylostomes are not so commonly caught on the mist nets. But one interesting thing is that when you talk about deforestation in the Cerrados, in the savannas of Brazil, we have something that we regard as the winners and the losers. So we have some bats that we actually think that they benefit from these changes, such as mainly the frugivores, because they mainly feed on pioneer plants. And when you cut the Cerrados, when in the forest, you have an influx of pioneer plants in the landscape, which can feed and benefit the species. But we also have some losers, such as the phyllostomin bats and the nectarivores. And because most of the resources that they feed on, they usually vanish from the landscape, and they might rely as well on these resources to actually move across the landscape, such as the nectarivores. So when you think about nectarivores, it's hard for a species that has such a high metabolism to move across the landscape when you don't have anything to feed between this distance. And when you look at the Cerrado deforested places, you can see that many times they have huge patches of land with no trees and no resources for any of the animals, these animals to feed on. This is a threshold showing the response of the bats to the remaining Cerrado left after deforestation. So you can see that different feeding gills, they react differently, and they also have different thresholds in terms of their resilience to landscape change and landscape loss. So you can see that nectarivores on the upper right, they have roughly, they go until 70%, 80%, and they start a sharp decrease on they start actually much sooner, but it accentuates a little bit more close to this threshold of remaining cerrados. So they're quite sensitive to landscape changes. And as I was saying before, that some frugivore species can actually be benefited from habitat loss. You can see by the curve on this graph that on the upper left, that they actually rise in abundance when you reach close to 20-25% of the remaining cerrado left on the landscape. And phyllostomin bats also decline very quickly with habitat loss. And sungivores, they have a more or less a more or less stable curve, mainly due to sometimes probably to the cattle ranching that happens in these areas, which also feed the animals that have been replaced in the landscape. When you're looking more specifically in terms of the protected areas in the Cerrado for bats, differently than we were talking about all the worries and how they protect badly the Cerrados, they actually do quite a good job in terms of protecting the bat species. So they actually most of the time placed on places with a high biodiversity of bat species. So most protected areas in the Cerrados are actually placed in the correct place for protecting bat species richness, because they usually, the place where they are usually have high bat species richness. This is part of my study from my master's, in which I was evaluating the impact of deforestation in the Cerrado assemblages. So you can see in the left, savanna woodland, which has been transformed into cattle ranch, into pastures. And on the right, gallery forest, which has been, the width of the forest has been shortened, and also there are massive gaps inside the forest due to cattle ranching and other types of threats. So what we did is that we went inside protected areas and outside protected areas on these conditions to evaluate how the bats were responding to deforestation in the savannas of Brazil, in the Cerrado. So some of the main finds that we found is that savannas, the savanna woodlands, they hold a quite different composition of assemblage species within and outside, inside and outside protected areas. But when you go to gallery forest, they hold a more similar structure of composition of bat species inside and outside protected areas. And we think that this is mainly also related with the fact that savanna woodlands, they have a much bigger change in terms of landscape structure than the gallery forests. The gallery forests, they have some impacts in terms of the deforestation, but they're much in a lesser extent than the savanna woodlands. But they still hold, both of them, similar species richness, which is quite interesting in this sense as well. And we believe that this in the savanna woodlands was mainly due to the attraction of bats to some plant species that were left on the landscape in the pastures, that were attracting bats and boosting the landscape and the species richness of bats in these places. Another interesting thing that we did is that we compare the body condition of the bats inside and outside protected areas, mainly for frugivores. So we wanted to test if the bats outside protected areas, they were actually being benefited by possibly the influx of pioneer plants. So we actually found that for Artibius lituratus and their Manura cinerea, which are two frugivore species, they actually have higher body conditions outside protected areas than inside the protected areas. So they're basically fatter outside protected areas and inside protected areas. So it seems that in this case, they're not actually being so much, they don't seem to be so much heavily impacted by these changes, at least these two species. Well, we also compared the reproduction rates because we thought that if they're having more food outside protected areas in terms of pioneer plants, this could also have an impact on the reproduction rates. So we compared them inside and outside as well for both habitat types. And we found that for Carolepis piscillata, which is another frugivore species, focused on pioneer plants, the reproduction rates were actually higher outside protected areas as well. This is a study from Aguiar, from the university here in Brasília, and they compare the species richness, functional diversity, and phylogenetic diversity of bats in different landscape, in different habitat types. We have more savanna-like habitats, but also forest habitat-like forest habitat types in the savannas. And they have basically shown that in all these three measures, species richness, functional diversity, and phylogenetic diversity, they all decrease with an increase in the land use of the landscape. So when you increase the deforestation, but diversity decreases in all the measurable ways that they used. So species richness, functional diversity, and phylogenetic diversity decrease, and this includes mist nets and acoustic recording. So it's an overall decrease of the bat assemblages that we have in the Cerrado across all these dimensions. One of the threats that the fire, as I was talking about, they can be heavily damaging the landscape, especially when they happen in the end of the dry season. I had the opportunity to measure the impact of the fire on the Aguiar forest here in Brazil. And we don't have the data before because we started actually one day after the fire happened. But one day after the fire happened, you can see that the assemblage of bats decreased to 4 individuals of one species. After 3 months, increased to 4 species in 10 individuals. And after 7 months, it increased to 8 species and 33 individuals. So we can see here that there's also a resilience of the bat community regarding these kind of threats as well for the landscape. Another important thing for bat ecology in the Cerrados and worldwide as well for many species are caves. So we have a lot of caves in Brazil and a lot of caves to be described as well. More than 10,000 caves have been recorded across Brazil at the moment. And they also play a big role in terms of the roosting ecology of the bats. So we have more than 40% of the bat species in Brazil currently being recorded using caves at some point or to some extent. But this is worrying because in 2008, there was a change in the Brazilian law. So all caves, or 70% of the caves in Brazil, they're not strictly protected right now. And before that, they were actually strictly protected, and you needed a legal permit to explore them. But right now, there's a lot of there's very few things that actually can guarantee a protection of a cave in Brazil, and some of them are endangered, endemic species to these caves. And bats are one of the main taxa to look at in this sense, because most of them, or a lot of them in Brazil, actually roost in caves. So this is just a general picture of the the caves in Brazil, which are in gray dots, and the triangles, the black triangles, are the ones that they're actually being studied in Brazil. So we actually don't know very well as well how the caves in Brazil are being used by the bats. But this is also worrying from the savanna point of view, because as you can see here in the center, most of the caves, or a lot of the caves of Brazil, are actually placed in the cerrados. And the caves of the cerrados, or the Brazilian savannas, they actually hold higher species richness of bats than other biomes, and also high abundance of bats than other biomes. So if you look at the caves in the cerrados, we're losing a lot of species and also a lot of bats as well, potentially at least. This is another study that I published from my work in the cerrados, which were looking at the interactions between the frugivorous bats and the landscape, the different landscapes. So we wanted to check if we wanted to protect the landscapes for the interactions, or for frugivores and nectarivores, where is the most important landscape? Where is the most important habitat type to protect? So is it gallery forests? Is it the savannas, or the savanna-like habitats, or the grasslands? Where should we, if we need to prioritize one of them to protect, where should we put these efforts? As we all know, efforts in conservation are highly skewed to some taxa, but also they're very scarce as well. So we need to prioritize them. So what we found is that actually the riparian forests, or the more forest habitats, they hold them not only a higher species richness of bats, but also a higher number of interactions. So most of the things that actually the bats, the frugivores are feeding, frugivorous bats are feeding on the cerrados, are on the forest habitats. When you give a closer look into these landscapes, they actually hold also a more, not only a higher species of plants for bats' diet, but they're also, the plant species that they have for bats' diets is also only happening in these landscapes. So this is a network that we built, where the interactions, they show the use of, or the plant species that is used on for a bat species, and these are the landscape, the habitat types. So this cluster dendrogram here shows the similarity of plant species composition of bat diet for each of these habitat types. So you can see here the gallery forests not only have a lot of plant species for the diets of the bats, but also is a very distinct community of plant species in comparison to the other habitat types of the Cerrado. So if you destroy, or if you cut the gallery forest, you're basically having a big impact on the diets of the bats, and potentially extinguishing a lot of species locally on the landscape, as I'm going to show on the next slide as well. The other habitat types, they show a more clustered plant species composition between them. So they can have some redundancy in terms of, if you extinguish one of them, how the other one can replace them for the bats' diet. But this also has, of course, a role. The landscape configuration has also a role in terms of these effects on the bats. In this analysis on the same paper, we wanted to check for a specific preference of bats for each of these landscapes in terms of the plant species that they eat in each of them. So we actually saw that not all of bats have the same preference across the landscape. So some of them actually have preferential, more specific preference for some habitat types within the Cerrado, while others have different preference. So some of them are more specialized in grasslands, such as Chiroptera aretus and Nora caudifera, or plant species are in these landscapes, while others have more forest preference, such as Lophostoма silviculum, Artibeus fimbriatus, and all these other species, or at least preference for the plant species that are in these landscapes. So the last thing that we did in the study is that we simulated the exclusion of these landscapes, or at least the exclusion of the extinction of the plant species from these landscapes, to check how they're going to impact the species richness of bats and their interactions in the Cerrado. So when we excluded forests from the landscape, we saw that actually 9 species of bats were lost, or frugivorous bats were lost, due to the loss of the plant species that are actually on these landscapes or these habitat types. When excluded savannas, we saw no change of, no extinction of bats due to the extinction of plant species on these landscapes, mainly due to the redundancy that other landscapes or the habitat types have in terms of having these species, the plant species on them. And when excluded savannas or extinguished savannas in our simulations, we saw the extinction of 1 bat species across the landscape. And also the interactions are mostly lost on the forest. So just to strengthen our finding that forests in the Cerrados, they play a huge role in terms of not only the survival of the bats, but also in terms of the plant species that they hold for bats' diets, and especially for frugivorous bats' diet. This just to give an overview about a little bit what I have done and a little bit of what I'm doing right now. So I was working with the secretary of the Cerrado for the Brazilian Bat Society in the year 2018, 2019. We're currently organizing a data set of Cerrado bats in the same format of the Atlantic bats, which was published in Ecology. So to get together the data from all bat biologists in the Cerrados and make this data available for anybody who is interested in exploring and analyzing this data. I'm also co-supervising a PhD student in the south of Brazil, which is working in the Cerrado. So she's mainly analyzing the impact or the importance of morphology, habitat use, diet, and evolutionary history in terms of structuring different bat assemblages across the landscape. And this wouldn't be possible with the help of a lot of people, and mainly friends, family, all the places that I have worked, and the incredible landscape of the Cerrado. Just to finish, this is a landscape that we have 200 kilometers from here, from Brasília, from the capital, so very close to the city. You can still find, although that's being quickly lost, all this amazing wilderness and all these waterfalls and the incredible biodiversity that we have in the Cerrados of Brazil. And that's it.
Well, thank you very, very much, Hernani. So if I can actually ask you all to quickly unmute and just give a round of applause, and especially considering the technical difficulties that we sometimes have, that'd be great. So thank you very much. So we're just going to go, we've got some questions. As I'd mentioned before, if anybody would like to raise their hands in chat, you can raise your hand and you can ask the question directly. Of course, if you prefer, you can put it in chat. So our first question is from Francisco, and he was saying, Hernani, do you think that the higher body condition on reproductive output or success outside of protected areas could be related to the lower complexity of bat communities outside protected areas, hence less competition?
That's a really good question. I think we don't know still like a lot about how these more complex variables can play a role in terms of these effects. So actually, we study in this case species by species to see how they reacted to these changes in the landscape. But it's very possible that they can together play a role, or competition or different variables can play a role in explaining or why we found this relationship for some species but not for others. So I think it's possible that competition can actually play a role for explaining these effects for some species but not for others. And we tested only in a very narrow range in terms of the whole range of Cerrado. So I think it's likely that they play, but we still don't know very much, because we basically don't have any studies, or few studies. We have actually one that I know regarding this, but few studies in this subject.
Thank you. And Rena asked, do you think that reproductive rates in and outside of protected areas are linked to the lifespan of the animal in and out of protected areas?
I think more than the lifespan, it can be linked with the different gestation periods of the bats, because some bats, they can have 2 or 1 or 2 gestations during, or even 3 sometimes, during a year. So they have different gestation periods, such as insectivores, usually they have 3 months of gestation, and while you have hematophagous bats, they usually have 7 months of gestation. So I think some of this difference, they can be linked with the difference in terms of how much the bats actually take to give birth to a pup. But I don't know how much this can be actually related with the lifespan of the bats, even though they have different lifespans across the taxa. But I think we don't know enough about the lifespan variation, I think, within most of these taxa to think about well, I think, in terms of this question. But it's a possibility, I think.
Thank you. And our next question is from Bahirathan. How was anthropogenic lighting within and outside of protected areas? Could you explain the observed differences?
Yeah, so usually outside protected areas, you have still very rural areas. So most of the lights, of the heavy lights in the Cerrados are within the cities, which in most cases, they are more not so close. The protected areas are not so close to the big cities. So I think usually the lights wouldn't play a big role in terms of affecting the biodiversity around protected areas because they're not so big cities, so much big cities around them. As I said before, the colonization of the Cerrado, of the center of Brazil, is still very recent in the history of Brazil compared to the Atlantic rainforest or the coast. So when you go to the outside protected areas, usually you don't see many lights. It's basically scattered lights around because still people sometimes hunt or they don't even have electricity in their houses still. But we have some exceptions as well. So I'm talking from now from Brasília, which is the capital, but just 50 meters away from my house, we have massive national parks such as the Brasília National Park with 45,000 hectares, and they still even have jaguars in the park. So this can be a little bit variable, but I believe in most of the cases, the lights are not impacting heavily outside protected areas because there are not a lot of urbanization still around them. But this is a very interesting topic for studying as well.
Thank you. And then Ram asked, as you discussed, bats are facing great challenges of habitat fragmentation and urgently need legal protection. So how bats are adapting to habitat alteration in the Cerrado, and what set of techniques are being used to understand bat behavior?
So as I said, looks like that some species are reacting reasonably well with even like increasing their abundance and reproduction rates and also the body condition of them. But some of them are not being very happy about these changes. And mainly what we use here as a technique to study bats are the mist nets. So we basically set the mist nets usually in the first part of the morning or of the night, even though there can be some variation, the species regions are using the temporal scale of the night, but we usually, most of the studies are focused on the first half of the night here. And we basically use mist nets, but we have been recently starting to include acoustic recordings as well on the monitoring the studies of the bats. But this has been a very recent trend in Brazilian bat history in the last 10 or less years that we have actually started to use more intensively acoustic recordings here.
Thank you. And Helen was asking, have you explored the impacts of different agricultural landscapes outside of protected area, for example, livestock versus arable?
That's a good question. I don't believe there's any study comparing these different changes. Like there's very, as I said, the studies on the impacts of the anthropogenic changes on the Cerrado landscape for bats is still very recent, and we still have a lot to uncover and to understand. And that's a very good question, but I don't believe we have any answer so far about this question. Apart from cattle ranching versus soybeans, I think this can be it's more clear that soybeans, they're more heavily impacting the bat communities because cattle ranching, they can be, sometimes people usually leave some trees on the landscape to give shade for the cows. So I think we don't understand very well, but I think my guess would be that this is a much less impactful way on the Cerrado bats than the agriculture in the Cerrados. And also I think one thing that I didn't mention, but can be potentially impacting for the bats as well, is that most of the water of the main rivers of Brazil actually are born in the Cerrados. So when people deforest the Cerrado, we're basically cutting or deforesting everything that keeps a water security in Brazil, in the whole country. And as I said, we're deforesting very quick, and also there has been a shortage in the water as well. We don't know how this is impacting the bats as well. But even here in the capital, in the recent years, we have some rational, we have been cutting water and restricting it just to some hours of the day during the dry periods here, which can be quite severe in the Cerrados as well. And we don't know how this impacts the bats as well, bat communities.
Thank you. And Quincy has asked, is there any hope or plans of improving and enforcing laws and legislations for protecting wildlife in Brazil?
That's a very good question. I wish we had, but I don't see this. I have spent the last 6 years outside the Cerrados, outside Brazil, but I have been following or trying to follow how the legislation has been going in Brazil. And unfortunately, under the presidency of Bolsonaro, things have been just declining and getting worse every day in terms of the environmental law. So I would like to say so, but I don't have any good expectations for that in the next at least 2 years and a half while Bolsonaro will be in power, or at least might be in power. We don't know what's going to happen here.
And we have a lovely next question from Dylan saying, can you describe a memorable bat encounter you've had?
Yep. So Chiroptera auritus is a carnivorous bat, and usually it's found only on protected areas, or more likely to be found in protected areas. And I remember one day that I was going to the park, and I left the nets closed and very close there, and I was going to open the nets to start the next day of sampling, and I just found a Chiroptera auritus, which was the only time that I had this, but it was entangled in the net in the beginning of the night, in the middle of the net, but it was closed and entangled in the middle of the net. I was quite surprised because it was the capture that we have that night, but it was the first time that I saw a Chiroptera auritus in my life, and it was a strange encounter because you didn't expect to find bats in a closed net, and it was even rode around the net. But yeah, it was very strange, but at least at the same time it was incredible in the sense that I have never seen this species before.
Thanks. And we have our next questions from Francesca, who's asking, do you have any evidence of diet shifting in bats due to the impact of land use change?
That's a very good question. I don't believe we have so far. This is a tricky question in Brazil, because I think for phyllostomids, because they shift their diets so much, or they can shift their diets quite intensively in terms of even some species that you believe, or we believed before, that were nectarivores, then can be shifted completely to insectivores. But in Brazil, the studies with DNA barcoding have only started a few years ago. So it's quite hard to actually measure these changes when you don't include DNA barcoding in the data, but we also don't have any, as far as I know, any study relating land use changes with the diets of the bats, not even with traditional methods. So I think that's also another subject to push for and to study more, and we have a vast field here to explore in this sense. I don't believe I know any study. There are some studies showing that bats can include pests from agriculture in the diets here in the Cerrados, but I don't believe there's any study comparing how the diets of the bats vary between protected areas, for example, and pastures and other types of more modified landscapes that we have here.
Thank you. And a question from Ross is asking, have you tried using acoustic lures to bring a higher flying bats to your mist nets?
No, I didn't. I was just, at the time, I was just using the very traditional methods to measure this. As I was saying, it was the first, as far as I know, it was the first study actually measuring in a systematic way, including multiple sites, how the bat diversity was impacted by anthropogenic change. So actually following a very traditional protocol, just setting the mist nets, same times of the day, same times of the night, same times of same sampling effort inside and outside protected areas to compare how diversity was changing across the landscape. I think today I would include much more things and I would measure things in a much more different and complex way than I did at the time. But at the time, it was the best that I could do and the best that I knew what to do.
And Louisa is saying, hi Hernani, that was a great talk. Do you think that frugivorous bats do better outside of protected areas because they benefit from tree plantations that are more abundant close to villages and human settlements? Maybe they switch diets to different species.
That's a very good question. I think it's very possible that they actually are using this landscape in a way that we are not so aware of, like in terms of including these plant species. We actually, my mom has a house just outside a national park, this national park here, and we have some plant species that are used on the agriculture, but we rarely see, I have rarely seen any bats flying around. I have actually even set some mist nets and I didn't catch anything. So I think it's possible that they might be using, but I think the structure of the landscape as it is here around the protected areas in the Cerrado, they might limit the movements of the bats across these deforested landscapes. I think some species such as the frugivores, they can fly more and more freely around these landscapes because I think they rely less in terms of their metabolism in finding food across short periods of time. But when you go to nectarivores, which they rely heavily, they have a high metabolism and they need to find flowers each short distance on the way to actually move across the landscape. They wouldn't be using this kind of fruits. But just to add in your question, I actually, in my master's, what we found is that the pequi is a local tree that we have here. People eat, they use in the cooking of the traditional culinary that we have here. And they usually live on the landscape after the deforestation for cattle ranching to give cover, to give shade for the cows, but also to have some fruit sometimes to eat. We found that actually these trees, they seem to be boosting the biodiversity of the bats in these deforested landscapes. So I think it's highly possible that this is actually happening here, but I would say probably that this is happening closer to the protected areas, and when you, as far as you go, the far you go from the protected areas, these ecosystem services, they're actually lost, which is one of the evidence that we have from masses, but we didn't have data to explore this in more details. But bat abundance seems to be decreasing when you go when you increase the distance from the protected areas. So I think it's possible, but I think the far that you go from a protected area, the less likely it is to have these ecosystem services functioning in the landscape, and also any bats benefiting from them.
Great, thank you. So I can't believe we've actually, we're at our time now. So I just want to say thank you very, very much for an inspiring and really informative talk. We can carry on for a little bit longer if people have time, but just for those of you who need to shoot off, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody, and from the Bats Without Borders team and all our participants, thank you very, very much. This has been really a great talk.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity as well to be here talking with you and sharing a little bit of my knowledge.
So we have another question from Francesca, who's saying, maybe I missed this, but I was wondering why bioacoustics was not used in most cases.
I think most of the reason, like the main reason, that we didn't have a very good library for bats in Brazil as well, before this, in the previous year. So we have 180 species of bats here, but what has been shown, as far as I know, is that the acoustic signature of the bats, that can actually vary geographically here in South America. And as we didn't know very well how they were, it would be difficult to study them. But also acoustic equipment can be quite expensive, like in terms of the currency that we have here in South America. And at least I can talk for Brazil that the taxes that we pay here for importing equipment from outside is 50%. So if you pay $1,000 for a acoustic recorder, you would pay $1,500 here in Brazil for importing this equipment here. So it's highly expensive. Sometimes you have some discounts from the government, depending on how you declare these items. But the price of the equipment, together with the lack of expertise as well, and the lack of libraries of the recordings of the bats here, which is incredibly diverse, I think triggered these past years of not understanding how the diversity was structured according to acoustic recordings, even though insectivores, they can be a big proportion of the bat species that we have here. And we're still describing a lot of species based on the acoustic recordings as well. And yeah, that's mainly it. But this only started in the last 10 years. I think before, I cannot remember about any study using actually acoustic. I might be wrong. I might be missing someone. I'm sorry if I'm missing someone that has actually published something about it before this time, but I cannot remember about any acoustic recording studies in Brazil before 2010. So things have actually started to take off from 2010 to now, which actually Ludmila Aguiar, which was my supervisor from my master's, actually is one of the main people who actually developing these libraries and putting a lot of effort into describing the signature of the bats, the collocation of the bats, which actually enabling us to dig a little bit more in terms of how the diversity here is shaped, and also how the changes are impacting insectivores in Brazil in comparison to frugivores, which fall in the mist nets, and we can much more easily study them in our country.
Thank you. And our last question is from Bruce. Would strict protection of caves as roosts in even very disturbed areas provide beneficial in Cerrado bats? For Cerrado bats?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We're actually developing a study right now, just suggesting some protected areas for, or evaluating the protected areas for a cave species of bats here. And I think it's highly likely that they actually would be beneficial. What we know so far is that some species of bats, they actually cave roosting specialists. So we don't know about any other roosts that they use. And some of these species actually, one of these species at least, is actually endemic of the Cerrado. So Loncophylla deckeseri only happens so far, have been described only for the Cerrado, and it's a cave roosting specialist. So we don't know any other, it's a vulnerable species as well, and we don't know any other roost type that it's actually using. So I think, at least from this species, I can say almost for sure, at least based on what we know so far, that's probably going to be heavily benefited from strictly protecting the caves in the Cerrados, not only for bats, but for everything. Yeah, I would like to say a little bit more, but I need to hold a little bit some results for the publishing procedure. But yeah, what we have seen so far in the analysis, that for this piece that we are analyzing well, is that at least for this species case, they seem to be heavily important in terms of explaining the occurrence of these species in the landscape. So in places where you don't have these caves, it's much less likely that we can find these bat species than places where you have caves. So everything leads to us to think that if you protect the caves, you strictly protect these caves where this species is known to occur, you can highly benefit them from this protection.
That's great. Thanks. So thank you very much. And I'm sure you've made everybody very, very jealous, and probably loads of people want to come out and do lots of field work with you. Awesome.
I would like to invite anyone who wants to come for a visit as well for something. We have a room here in the house if anybody wants to come one day, and even I don't have a license right now to capture bats here, so I'm not going to the field. And also because of COVID-19, we're kind of not going to the field. But after all this is over, and if I'm still here, I don't know if I'm going to stay here in the Cerrado or move to another country for my next job. But you're all highly welcome to come here one day if you want. My mom also likes to receive people and to host people, my friends. So if anybody wants to come one day to spend some lovely nights in the Cerrado and get to know a little bit of more of our biodiversity. I always feel that, because I feel that Cerrado is so less known, so very poorly known outside Brazil, that's kind of my role, to advertise a little bit and talk about it when I'm outside. So it's always a pleasure to talk about, and everybody who wants and can come is invited to, for well, a tour around, like at least to show a little bit of how the Cerrado is and how the biodiversity here is in the landscape.
Excellent.
Distributed in the landscape.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to end the recording now.